the Valkyrie. As the only child of a renowned knight, the girl had grown up wanting for nothing. She was virtuous, cheerful, and possessed of a beguiling charm. And when she came of age, offers of marriage arrived from aristocrats and royal families of every region. Her father allowed her the freedom to select for herself whom she might marry. But the freedom that her father had bestowed only distressed the young maid. Does he not care whom I marry? An aspect of her father's behavior had not gone unnoticed to her. There were times, just small moments, when he did not seem to care about her, and she knew the reason why. As a knight, her father wanted a son to carry his name. Her father was the sternest, most gentle, and strongest person she knew. To her, he was the very ideal of a knight, the ideal person, the ideal male. But that which her father truly wanted, she could never be. This had cast a shadow over her heart for as long as she could remember, so exercising the freedom bestowed upon her, she came to a decision. She decided to become a knight. The girl wanted to win her father's approval more than anything. She wanted him to truly love her, and so to earn his respect, she decided to abandon a woman's happiness. She cut off her long, silken hair and cast away her dresses. Sword fixed at her side, she enlisted for knightly instruction. Knowing that she could not match a man's power, her agility would be her strength. She trained to be the fastest, the most agile. Perhaps due to her parentage, she was blessed with natural skill at arms. After several years, her skills surpassed that of all the knights in the realm. She perfected her talents at 20 years old, but in doing so, she came to a realization. Whenever she faced skilled male opponents, the disparity in strength would prove an unscalable wall. No one could equal her in dexterity or agility, but her inability to match strength for strength was a dangerous weakness. Moreover, with her woman's frame, it was a deficit physically insurmountable. Years of devoted training combined with her natural talent had brought her to the peak of her ability. But it seemed she could never become the person her father had wanted her to be. Is there any greater injustice than her fate to be destined to disappoint her father from the moment she was given life? At this realization, she was cast into the depths of despair. It was then she had a strange vision. A chalice buoyant in the air, a voice issued forth. Pay the price, do so, and your wish will be granted. Entranced, the woman accepted the offer and paid the price. In return, her knightly skills were doubled and redoubled again. Until then, she had been quick, but only as quick as you or I think of quick. Her newfound agility was like lightning. It was as if her body was a dynamo. Indeed, she was even able to produce electric shocks at will. She was ecstatic. However, her beautiful looks had twisted into a horrible visage. Her beauty was her sacrifice, but this was trivial now. Now her father would acknowledge her. Now he would love her. Reining in her high spirit, she made ready to journey to the battlefield where her father was. However, setting out from her home, a tragic message arrived. It was news of her father's death in battle. She couldn't believe it. The man she had admired and whose love she needed was already lost. To see with her own eyes, she headed to the battlefield. As if spurred by her great urgency, wings sprung from her armor, guiding her through the air. Thunder boomed and lightning flashed upon the beating of her wings. Arriving at the battlefield, she began her search. Fallen soldiers of both armies lay there. Silence and death hung in the air. For 3 days and 3 nights she walked among the human detritus, but was unable to find her father, living or dead. On the morning of the 4th day, she departed the battlefield bearing a new resolution in her breast. She would become the most powerful warrior in the world and spread her name far and wide, in hope that the tale of her prowess would reach her father, on earth or in heaven. And in doing so, she might finally claim her long-sought-after trophy, her father's love. Ever since, she has flown from battlefield to battlefield, challenging warriors of renown to further her glory. The Troll. His life epitomized the fall from grace. As a knight, he had once earned glory and honor, and people showered him with adulation. But with each passing step in his climb to fame, he forgot the humility of his youth. the tireless efforts that had made him a warrior. His standing proved a fragile thing. A single lost battle was all it took. Facing total defeat, the knight had fled. His escape had been a narrow thing, but he made it home alive. The same could not be said for those he left behind. His reputation plummeted overnight, as if all his prior feats had never been. Soon he was a pariah, utterly ignored. The knight had lost all he had save one thing: his arrogant pride. Even in ignominy, he clung to his former glories with the desperation of a drowning man flailing towards the light above. The tales of his exploits swelled from exaggeration to outright fantasy. One of his favorite tales to tell was the time he slew a giant. He gave this phantom creature the most fiendish traits he could think of, all the better to demonstrate his own purported valor and might. It was as big as a mountain, as strong as 100 oxen, the story went, and its wounds healed almost instantly. The gruesomeness of its appearance was rivaled only by the vileness of its stench. The knight continued to lie to impress, and sometimes turned to physical intimidation to convince them. His tall tales grew more and more outlandish, and they became so embellished that with time the knight could no longer distinguish between what was true and what was myth. He quickly learned his stories had gained more traction the further into the countryside he went. There, more country bumpkins were available for exploitation. He took up residence in one such quiet village. There, he bullied and frightened his way to an easy, if still meager, life. His former reputation was the only thing separating him from a common scoundrel. The villagers were terrorized, unable to resist him alone. They hired a mercenary from a nearby city. The towering sellsword stood before the braggart knight, his challenge clear. The knight in response began to tell his favorite tall tale in order to cow the mercenary. Yet the story was so obviously false to a true fighter that the mercenary saw right through it. The description of the giant alone was completely ridiculous. "A bone-chilling tale," replied the sellsword, "if it were true." His buff clawed. The knight scrambled to his feet and fled, but the sellsword's blade found its mark. Slashed across the back, the liar fell to the ground. That was when it appeared. The braggart's darkening vision was filled with a white light. Its source was a floating chalice. The vessel's words flowed into him. "Tender the fee, and all your tales will be made truths." The man accepted. From the wound upon his back, a swollen growth erupted, as though all his puffed-up stories had been made flesh, overflowing and bursting out of him in a single mass. Larger and larger it grew until it took the shape as the upper body of a man near as big as a mountain and strong as 100 oxen, a man whose wounds healed almost instantly, whose hideous visage was rivaled only by the putrescence of its stench. Less a man, perhaps, than a giant. The giant born of the knight's boasts and grown from his flesh, then proceeded to raze the village to the ground. The knight was already painfully aware of the colossal effort it took to live a lie. Now he was expending his life's energy on maintaining this manifestation of his made-up giant. The burden was so great that merely remaining upright sapped dreadfully at his vitality. Though vindicated now that his tales had become real, the disgraced knight never had the chance to gloat. He had lost his humanity the instant he became host to the monstrous giant, and even now he stalks the countryside. The musicians of Bremen. He was a member of the church chorus. His honeyed voice earned him a place in their troupe as a child. Thanks to a physiological oddity, his range never dropped with age, and he was able to remain in the role well into adulthood. And so he kept singing and thought of little else. Years came and went until he stood at the cusp of old age. His voice now lacked the force it held in youth or the richness. He was pressured to retire, let go due to his age. Having lived for his career, his life now stood empty. With nothing to animate him, he seemed to age overnight. His hair grayed and wrinkles appeared. The transformation worried his family. Unable to sing, he'd lost his reason to live. So strong was his attachment to his former career, He wore the chorus robes even in retirement. Age continued to ravage his body until soon his mind too failed. He grew so senile he mistook the mule he kept for a son. He soon became a burden on his family, for a man who can't tell his son from a mule can't care for himself. No longer working, he had no income, yet it still cost money to feed him. Enough is enough, they began to say, and so he was ousted once again, this time by his own family. Even senile, he understood with tragic clarity. He understood it had happened again. He'd been thrown out. Was it so criminal to grow old? He set out for a place where people gather, the mule he considered a son in tow, still dressed in his choral robes. He began to sing in his creaking voice. Barely a whisper emerged, and even that was garbled. But the passion was unmistakable. It was his appeal to the world. "I am still alive," it exclaimed. In time, people gathered, no doubt moved by the old man's heartfelt performance. Passerby would stop to listen and leave some coin. Though perhaps ungainly, he stood before them a bona fide singer. Senile or no, he was happy, but audiences are fickle, and the novelty of the old man's performance soon wore thin, leaving only a creaking voice behind. In a few days' time, no one spared him a second look. He would soon be wholly unwanted again. No matter how weak his mind grew, one memory never faded: the desolation of being discarded. He would not suffer that again. That was when it appeared before him, a strange chalice hanging in the air. It spoke, "Pay the price and you shall have your wish." The relic of legend had chosen him, yet its words could not reach the old man. Age had dulled his mind after all. The old man's wish was granted, though he stood there unawares. It was his son beside him who answered the chalice, the mule he kept in tow. Motivated by senility though it was, the mule was thankful for the love the old man showed. It longed to repay him, and so it offered up its flesh to see its owner's, no, its father's wish granted, to restore the voice he pined for. The man shed years of age in moments. The mullish traits he grew were likely his son's influence. What's more, his urge to sing brought forth changes. The mule man's body took the form of a musical instrument. It was the birth of a strange new instrument that brayed like a mule. Soon the mule man drew curious eyes once more. He was a musician again. He was happy until he noticed his body had vanished. His panic, though, was short-lived. He found his son soon enough. This time it was a cast-out dog. His body and voice had regained their youth, but not his mind. With dog in tow, the mule man sang his asinine songs for passerby. But even the strangest curiosities lost their novelty with time, and the crowd's interest waned. Once more he fell into despair. Had he been cast aside? Was he unneeded? His voice was steeped in sorrow, but the most impassioned plea became cliched with repetition. More tragic still, his faulty memory kept him from seeing that. As if to compound tragedy, the same scene then played out. The chalice appeared and posed the same bargain verbatim. Again it failed to reach him. That role fell once more to his son. For the dog too was grateful for the father's love it had been given. It offered up its body to repay the man. The mule man's mouth opened wide, and from his throat emerged a canine face. It sang in a harmony of howls and brays, an instrument like no other, and the crowds returned. Sadness and loss gripped the man a third time now, until he found his son, this time a cat. Again he forgot his proud child, and again the cycle was repeated. The harmony of the mule and dog grew stale. The man despaired, and the chalice appeared. The thankful cat offered up its flesh in sacrifice. From the mule's mouth sprang a dog's face, from a dog's a cat, and so a harmony of three species was born. Still the crowds grew bored. The man next son was a cockerel. It heard the chalice's offer in his stead and offered up its form. Mule, howl, cat, and rooster now sang in concert. But the cycle ended there. The man's form was now so monstrous that none would listen to his strangely beautiful song. They were too repulsed. He was finally, irrevocably, discarded. And so this curious monster wanders the lands still, in search of anyone who will listen to its song. Beelzebub. Once there lived an aristocrat of exceptional pride. He left all but the most important matters of his daily life to his servants. How ought a man of my station be expected to perform such menial tasks? Such was ever his refrain. But even the aristocracy aren't exempt from the caprices of Lady Fate. His opulent life would not last forever. Struck barren by disaster, the fields of his land produced no grain, nor could his people pay their taxes. The aristocrat was ruined, and yet, even destitute, the man's prideful attitude never faltered. Gone were the servants that tended to his needs, yet still he refused to shoulder that burden himself. Still the words echoed in his empty halls. How ought a man of my station be expected to perform such menial tasks? Someone take care of it. But the man was not a complete fool. He knew very well that no such someone remained, yet he could not help but speak the words. The fallen noble's manor soon fell in turn, degrading into a mountain of rubbish, a den of flies. Perhaps due to this filth, the aristocrat took ill. Still the same refrain continued. Someone bring me medicine. Someone fetch the finest doctor in the land. The man's pride would soon quite literally be the death of him. As his condition worsened, his haughty commands became little more than hoarse groans. With the last of his strength, he spoke once more. How ought a man of my station be expected to die in such ignominy? Someone save me. His final plea came through teeth gritted so tightly they could have splintered. The man, once proud enough to wish death before dishonor, finally relinquished the motto that had come to define his being. These daggers to his pride, his final words, were spoken in less than a whisper, drowned out by the beating wings of the circling flies. No one could have heard his plea, even had anyone remained to listen. Yet a strange reply came from the empty darkness. I shall grant your wish, should you be prepared to pay its price. A strange vision appeared before the delirious nobleman. The voice's source was a chalice of pure white floating in midair. The fallen noble accepted. As his strength returned, he spoke his orders in a crisp, loud shout. Someone fetch me my supper. But his men had long deserted him. Imagine a man of his stature with no menials. It simply would not do. The wait for dinner wasn't long. A host of new servants had jumped to attention. Whatever the man's orders, these new stewards gladly obliged. It was almost as if the man had his grand old household back. The sole difference was that these new servants weren't human. It was the bloated swarms of flies that infested the manor who served its master now. He never thought of his human servants again. He no longer saw any virtue in the service of man. With time, even the nobleman's visage came to resemble that of the flies around him. But he remains unaware of his transformation, unaware that he has lost human speech, that he will soon lose human thought as well. He speaks the tongue of flies and sees the world through their eyes now. The man believed keeping servants was necessary to safeguard his pride. So keen was he to stand above all men, he cared not as his own body was transformed into something baser, for that was the true price of his wish. The proud aristocrat had attained a new form, new power, a new title as the Fly King. And now he travels his former lands with servants in tow, eager to reclaim what is his by rights. Hydra. Once a great swordsman was born to a severely impoverished land. To support his family, he worked as a mercenary. The swordsman was blessed with rare ability. His dexterous hands, he was able to manipulate swords as if they were a part of his body, and he fought to provide for his poor family. To support them, he would need a reputation, and for a reputation, many victories. For victories, it was necessary to slay a great many foes. And so the sword technique he devised was the practical application of his necessities. To defeat many enemies at once and thereby achieve many victories at once, he used many swords at once. You may be imagining him with a sword in each hand at this moment, but that wasn't so. The swordsman's technique was to use 3 or more swords at the same time. Witnesses to his technique likened it an acrobat performing juggling tricks, and so it became known as the sword juggling style. To opponents on the battlefield, his technique was utterly unpredictable, and countless bodies lay in his wake. Before long, soldiers would flee in fear when they heard of the swordsman's coming. One day, a general, fearing the swordsman, schemed to defeat him. Deciding it unwise to face the swordsman head-on, he resorted to deceit. He bribed a comrade in arms of swordsman to poison his evening meal. The virulent poison was created from gallbladders of venomous snakes and brought the swordsman to death's door. For 3 days and 3 nights he convulsed in agony, but the swordsman survived. However, even after recovering, numbness pervaded his body. Neither his arms nor legs could move as they once had. His feared and respected technique was forever lost. The swordsman grieved mightily. The perfection of his technique had become his very reason to live. Of all the things he valued, he had been most proud of his skill and renown on the battlefield. The fact that his endeavors had brought his family out of poverty brought him no comfort at all. His was an irreplaceable loss. Despairing, the swordsman prepared to throw himself into the sea and end it all. But just then a strange sight befell his eyes. A chalice hung in the air before him and spoke. "Pay the price and I shall grant your wish." Entranced by the vision, he decided to obey the voice and named his offering. In truth, the swordsman's decision was at odds with his original objective. What had once been a means to fulfill his objective had now become the objective, and the objective became the means. The swordsman has honed his technique in order to provide for his family, but now he had lost his technique. He offered his family as sacrifice to regain it. Walking the line between life and death on the battlefield had corrupted his soul. True to his wish, the swordsman's body began to change. New arms grew from his poison-ravaged belly. Perhaps influenced by the poison, the new arms were shaped like snakes. Furthermore, the snakes' tongues were made of sharp blades. Body and mind were now united in the way of the sword. Elated, the swordsman returned to the fields of war. Warring soldiers were taken aback by the sudden appearance of this monster. The long, thick arms protruding from his belly presented tempting targets for his opponents, but new arms would grow back upon dismemberment. Moreover, where one had been severed, 2 would grow back in its place. And so it was that the warrior of 9 arms and 9 swords came to be. To his opponents, he was a nightmare given form, with new arms growing from his wounds. His strength only increased. No man could stand against him. The swordsman's opponents were no more. Any who saw his monstrous form fled for their lives. What use were 9 swords with none to fight? And what use was his newly perfected 9-sword juggling? And so even now the swordsman's cravings go unsatisfied. He awaits the arrival of a worthy opponent and a chance to put his 9 swords to use. Goodbye.